Hi everyone, welcome to part 8 of my Why I Love Between the Bare to Me White Walls series. As usual, there's links in the description so you can skip around to different parts of the video. If this is the first video that you're watching in this series, I recommend starting from part 1. I make references to things that I've already mentioned in previous videos, and it'll be easier to follow along if you start from part 1. In this video, we're picking up where we left off, and we're going to cover everything up until the solo section. We have a lot to talk about, so let's get to the playthrough. So we start off this new section with the Vibraslap and the F sharp tritone power chord being held out from the previous section. While this chord is ringing out, we get a whole tone influenced 16th note run, a bit more on that later, that's harmonized a major third higher. I think the lower voice is the main melody here, and it starts on F sharp, so I built the whole tone scale spelling starting from F sharp. There are only 2 whole tone scales, but spelling of the notes for each one is different depending on which note you build the scale from. Either way, there are 2 sets of harmonic equivalents, so I don't think the spelling matters much. Since the whole tone scale are a series of whole steps without a leading tone, they don't really have tonic or tonic function. Here, its dizzying, ambiguous effect is used as a great transition, as many TV and movie soundtracks tend to use it for. Another interesting thing to mention is that this is all played over that same F sharp tritone power chord that's being sustained. The flat 5 is a C, but we could call it a B sharp to fit the whole tone scale. B sharp in this case would be an augmented 4th. Even though we've assumed so far that our tritone or flat 5 power chords have implied diminished functions, here the absence of the minor third helps the chord to fit the melody perfectly. The ambiguous chord matches the ambiguous scale. Another cool thing to mention is that the whole tone scales are sometimes simply thought of as pairs of augmented triads, F sharp and G sharp augmented in this case. This section, however, is played over a diminished power chord that is found in the scale and harmonically. So, we get a bit of diminished and augmented in this section. Another thing to mention is the execution of this melody in the colors recording. I believe the straight 16th note rhythm was the intention, but I don't think that's what was recorded on the album. After listening to this section slowed out a bunch of times so I could actually play it, I heard that the rhythm wasn't even. This is a closer approximation of the rhythm, but I still think it's wrong. Either way, I looked for more live videos of this section and I found Paul playing it relatively straight for most of the videos. This leads me to believe that the intention was straight 16th notes, but the speed and fingering led to this phrasing and rhythm. I don't think it changes the ambiguous function of this section. If anything, the looseness of the rhythm helps to add to the ambiguity. This isn't a critique on Paul's technique or anything like that. It's crazy fast, and I think this is what his fingers did naturally. I'm pretty sure the whole tone effect was the point of this section anyways. So the part I'm talking about is this, but I think what his fingers did was this. At the end of this section, we get a descending phrase from the whole tone scale in the rhythm guitars and bass. I put a 1/8 measure because I feel like it's acting like an anacrusis pickup bar to the next Chugga Chugga section. I also didn't include it in the previous measure because I think it makes more sense for the section to start and end on F sharp, and the fast whole tone lick ends there. Since our emphasis has been on F sharp so far, and the chugging section stays on the F sharp tritone power chord, the E is used to give a sense of a change of direction, in this case literally and figuratively. In our Chugga Chugga section, we return to the F sharp tritone power chord. Here the accents are the same accents that the drums had in the whole tone section. There's also a cool crescendo in the vocals that are repeating the same while alternating between the left and right speaker with each repeat. This 2-measure phrase repeats 4 times before the drums and bass change to a more breakdown type of feel on the 5th repeat. On the 6th repeat, we get the return of the whole tone fast lick with a single E note like before, which brings us to the next section. We then get a new transition with a hint of whole tone. This new phrase begins with an F augmented triad, one of the 2 triads not found in our previous whole tone scale, in beat 1 of the measure. This triad can also be named an A augmented or a C sharp augmented. This augmented triad is the result of half-step movement downwards and begins the process of going from our ambiguous tonality to one that's more defined. We then get a G and B for a G major in beat 2 with what would be an implied A on the weak beat, so we can ignore the A. We're starting to get even more tonal and less ambiguous harmony here. G is the relative major of E minor, so it looks like we're heading back to E minor. We then get an E chord followed by an A7. The E to A7 can be seen as a secondary dominant 5 of 5/7 kind of deal. You can also see the E major as a chromatic mediant-submediant relationship, but the circle of fifths movement makes more sense to me. We then go to a B minor in a triplet bass measure. Here the A7 acts as a sort of backdoor dominant to the B minor. This is followed by a C major and an E flat tritone. You could also see this as a D sharp tritone, which would imply a rootless B7 chord, which would also make sense. However, the way I'm seeing this beat is as the beginning of an F sharp diminished 7 chord. That's why I use E flat and not D sharp. Although the next group of triplets begins with an E and G, implying E minor and helping the case for the rootless B7, I think these notes are a continuation of the phrase from F sharp diminished 7. The G appears in step, but the E shows up by leap. The figure that begins on the E is doubled by the bass, so I feel E is important. We'll get back to that. The next 2 notes are F sharp and C. And the other guitar part has A and E flat. This gives us the completed F sharp diminished 7 chord. That's why I saw the previous beat as the beginnings of the F sharp diminished 7 chord. We then end in a measure that helps reestablish E minor as the tonal center with a power chord progression that hints at Phrygian again with the F power chord. The F sharp diminished 7 has a great pull towards E minor. Before going on, we should discuss that low E under the F sharp diminished 7 chord. I feel like this is acting like a pedal point anticipation for the upcoming E minor, and I think it's pretty effective. So for this section, we end up with a reduction that sounds something like this. This then leads us into the Ant to the Sky reference. The original Ants of the Sky part from about 2 minutes and 45 seconds goes something like this. The White Walls version has different accents when compared to the original Ants of the Sky section. At first, the low chugs and chord stabs are separated between the two guitars and they're panned hard left and hard right. After 2 repeats, they are then combined into one part like the original Ants section. While both feature the same chord stab E suspended 4 rhythms in the beginning, the Chuggs in the Ants part that is in 7 finishes on an upbeat, while the White Walls finishes on a downbeat. If we think of that part in 7 as 1 2 1 2 1 2 3, we see that the upbeat that we finished on in Ants has now been moved up to the and of 2 in our second set of 2 beats in White Walls. This move note has now shifted the rest and makes the second set of chord stabs start on an upbeat. By doing this, the measure can now finish on a downbeat. We can also see that this 2 stab and 2 chug group from Ants is kept intact by making this move to finish on a downbeat. In White Walls, we then go to a part in 6. I can make some stretches to find some connection to Ants here, but I really feel like this is more of a new exploration of the Ants riff. Things have already changed, and this is another change to the riff as a whole. One connection I will mention is one between the part in 7 and the part in 6. If we divide the part in 6 into groupings of 1 2 3 1 2 3, we can see some similarities to the part in 7 that will make this flow well. The part in 6 mimics the part in 7 better than the original second measure of the Ants section. The accents 1 and are still there. We also have an ending on an upbeat from 2 and from 7 and 3 and from 6. And because we divided the 7 into 1 2 1 2 1 2 3, we can also finish with and 2 and 3. Although at first glance, the changing time signatures would make you think that this is a more chaotic version of the Ants riff, it actually feels more defined and complete to me. The similarities that the part in 7 and 6 from White Walls have that are missing from the Ants riff could symbolize that things are now starting to come together and make more sense as we head towards the end. On the last repeat, the end of the measure in 6 has the last few beats as E power chords to get us ready for the pit. The Chuggs lead us into a cool riff that's derived from the E half whole tone scale, also known as our old pal the Octatonic scale. We have 8 different notes in this scale as the name implies. The Octatonic scale can also be thought of as 2 diminished 7 chords, in this case E diminished 7 and F diminished 7. This is also really cool because we just used the whole tone scale, which is a hexatonic scale. We're using some different symmetrical scale action back to back. In order to get a better idea of what the harmony this phrase may be implying, it helps to look at a later repeat of this phrase. The first time this phrase is played in 4/4, it's played over a lone tritone power chord. The second time it's played in 4/4, the B flat in the bass puts this chord in second inversion, after being in first inversion with the 3/4 variant of this phrase. More on that later. The bass has 4 quarter notes, so that's why I originally saw this phrase as representing 4 chords. The other 3 bass notes are all chord tones, so E, G, and B flat give us an E diminished triad. Next, I put A flat diminished 7, but we only have A flat and C flat. I use A flat diminished 7 because I feel like this is an implied F diminished 7, or at least it's functioning similarly. I think this interpretation jives well with the construction of our diminished scale, alternating E diminished 7 and F diminished 7. Next, the major third of B flat and D, or E double flat, is the first disruption of minor third intervals in this phrase. I put 7 in parentheses because we could include the following F and A flat interval to make a B flat 7 chord. If the F diminished 7 is its own chord, then it has that back and forth tendency that the previous A flat diminished 7 had. If it's all a B flat 7, then the B flat gets to stay the same in the next E diminished 7, while the F and A flat descend by half step to create an E and G, completing the E diminished triad. So, the reduction would be something like this. We then go to our Tritone Breakdown. The breakdown references the previous Ants of the Sky bass riff we were just playing. The note groupings and rhythms are identical, we're just chugging on that E tritone instead. We then get a half whole tone idea again, but the last beat of the 4/4 measure has been removed and is now a 3/4 measure. When the Chuggs start again, we end up changing the 6/4 measure to 5/4. This happens so that half whole tone idea can be repeated in its original 4/4 form. The 7/4 measure remains the same, so I see it as only the last two measures changing. We then go for another repeat. We now see that the first half of the riff is different. The first 6 beats are the same, but the 7th beat has now been replaced with 3 quarter note triplets. This means we have added a beat, making this 2 measures of 4/4 or 8/4. The next 5/4 measure is the last 5 beats of the original 6/4 measure, which takes us into an incomplete 3/4 version of the half whole tone idea. In our last repeat, the first 2 4/4 measures are now the same as before, but now the following measure is the last 4 beats of the original 5/4 measure. We then get a repeat of that earlier triplet fill, but now I'm viewing it in 12/8. The main melody of the fill is still 4 groups of 3, but the rhythm section makes more sense in 12/8. 2 measures of 6/8 would also make sense, but that would split our fill into 2 measures, and I like the idea of keeping it whole while alternating everything else. The accents of the first beat of each 3-note, 8th note group go along with both the 12/8 and original triplet structure. But the introduction of these 16th note divisions make it more complicated for a triplet interpretation. Although, subdividing triplets wouldn't be totally crazy considering everything else we've done so far. The 3 quarter notes for the remaining 6 beats of the 12/8 measure are what made me want to view it in 12. If we're using triplets from the original 4/4 fill, the last 3 quarter notes would be quarter note triplets that follow 16th note triplets that have just been recently subdivided from 8th note triplets. 12/8 would make it a lot easier to count and feel the underlying pulse, given the melody and harmony. We then have a tempo change going into a cool fill that really emphasizes the song being in E minor again. We're going from about 200 BPM to about 180 BPM. Part of what makes this tempo transition so smooth is the dropping out of the rhythm section while a lone guitar plays the fill. This part then goes into a reprise of the section we covered in episode 6 with some slight changes. The descending triplet figure is no longer harmonized in thirds. It's now supported by quarter note power chords, A, E, G, and D, before going into a new 3/4 measure that also descends. This new measure, however, is harmonized in thirds like the triplet measure was before. This 3/4 measure also further emphasizes the tonicizing of E minor. We then go into the same time signature changing ascending riff we covered in part 6 for the first 4 measures. After the B minor measure, we start to see some differences. In the first appearance of this riff, we began with a 5/4 measure with an emphasis on C. In this reprise, we begin with a 9/8 measure emphasizing B minor. There also appears to be 2 implied chords per measure this time. It's pretty clear in the descending E minor triad in the last 3 beats of the 9/8 measure. We then go into a measure that emphasizes C like before, but this time it's in 4/4. A beat has been removed, and there is now an implied D chord in the second half. The next measure emphasizes D like before, but is now in 7/8. This measure also has the low E on the downbeat, continuing the motif from the previous 2 measures. This reprise will continue to emphasize E on the first downbeat. This measure also implies an E minor towards the end like before, but the phrase does not descend like before. We then go into a 6/8 measure that is the same 3 beats as the previous 5/4 version of this idea. Finally, the section ends with a 2/4 measure emphasizing F sharp half diminished 7 like before without the hint of B minor. One last cool bit about this reprise is the 4 measures before the F sharp minor 7 flat 5 measure all decrease by 1/8 note at a time. This helps the changing time signatures to give this section the feeling of winding down towards something, and I think it helps to bring us to this next grooving section. This next section is another reference to what happened earlier in the riff from part 6 after the ascending time signature change riff. In this version, we see that we've kept the concept of changing time signatures every measure. We can see the 3/4 measure as the first 3 beats from the version in part 6, which was originally in 5/4. The way I like to see this version is that it's a continuation of the part 6 variation. The version from part 6 repeated the 5/4 measure 3 times before going into a 3/4 measure, which is the same 3/4 measure we have this time. This version of the riff is picking up where the previous riff left off. We now go into a 3/8 measure that implies D major. After this, we get a 3/4 measure combined with a 3/8 measure with the middle 8th note removed, making it a 4/4 measure. Here you can make the argument that the 3/4 and 3/8 measures are actually one measure of 9/8, but I like the idea of keeping the nod to the previous 3/4 measure and 3/8 as the new concept. The upside to the 9/8 argument is you can see the removal of a single eighth a bit better. We then repeat these measures one more time before moving on. In this next bit, the two guitars and bass are no longer in unison. The middle voice is the most similar to what we've been looking at so far. We can see that the 3/8 changes to 7/8, which is further supported by the bass restarting the phrase it played before in 3/4 with an added 8th note. The 3/8 becoming 7/8 is another reason why I didn't use 9/8 for the previous version of this riff. Even though the 7/8 measure is longer than the 3/4, it still provides this confusing feeling of being shorter due to the subtraction of the first low E. This subtraction plus the addition of a beat at the end helps to add to the controlled chaos happening here. Our previous emphasis on E minor, A minor, and D is now replaced by each measure containing a portion that could imply some movement back to E minor. The bass plays figures that imply E minor add 9 that I believe work more like a pedal than they do to contributing to the push-pull of the harmony in the guitar parts. The new melody is also initially emphasizing this E minor add 9. The F sharp in the bass and the new melody part can imply an F sharp minor 7 flat 5 towards the end of the 3/4 measure which wants to resolve to E minor or G. F sharp minor 7 flat 5 is an A minor with an F sharp in the bass. The 7/8 measure can be seen as implying an E minor add 9, but could briefly introduce a B7 without the third if the bass is considered. I feel like it's too brief to really have that dominant function and see it all as E minor add 9. The bass also hits an E at the end before restarting in 3/4. The repeat of this riff shows that a 6/8 measure replaces the 7/8 measure, adding the addition, subtraction, push-pull vibe that's going on. Again, with no D sharp or C in 7/8 or 6/4, I see this as 6/8 emphasizing E minor add 9. We then go into a 7/8 riff that repeats 3 times, implying E minor add 9 again, with the bass playing around with E octaves. This riff provides tension all while feeling stable at the same time. This transition can represent the previous chaos and ambiguity becoming something tonally centered again. Somewhat similar to the ants-white walls relationship we looked at earlier, we have two things that should be chaotic, but are feeling more normal as we head towards the end. We then go into 3 descending measures that begin on C, with the middle one an octave higher. This emphasis on C in these 3 measures, and the final note being an A, is similar to the E minor to A minor C relationship we've been seeing so many times in this track. We had 3 measures of E minor at 9, and now have 3 measures of C A minor. This all takes us to one big E minor chord that is hit with the entire band, accenting beat 1 of our solo section. This is a great transition to take us to our melodic solo section that we will explore next time. Well, that's it for this episode. Please comment, thumbs up, and subscribe, and all that good stuff. Please leave me some suggestions for future videos. Let me know your opinions on the things that I've said. Let me know if you found any errors or any improvements I can make on these videos. I've got a Facebook page, an updated public Instagram profile, and an untapped profile if you're into that kind of stuff. There's links in the descriptions for all of that. So, until next time, see ya!